In 2013, 50 years after Penkovsky's execution, CIA published final assessment of his intelligence contribution. The document was comprehensive analysis of how his information had shaped Cold War history. The conclusion: Penkovsky provided intelligence that fundamentally altered the strategic balance between the United States and Soviet Union during the most dangerous period of the Cold War. His information about Soviet missile capabilities allowed American leadership to negotiate from position of knowledge rather than assumption. This contributed to peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis and established foundations for strategic arms negotiations that would eventually end the Cold War. The assessment quantified his impact in specific terms. Penkovsky provided technical specifications for 120 Soviet weapons systems. He documented deployment procedures for ballistic missiles, air defense systems, and command structures. He revealed the Soviet nuclear arsenal was one-third the size American intelligence had estimated. He showed that Soviet ICBM accuracy was insufficient for counterforce targeting, meaning Soviet strategy relied on terrorizing cities rather than destroying military targets. Most critically, he provided the timeline showing how long it took to make R-12 missiles operational after deployment. This single piece of information allowed Kennedy to know the Cuban missiles weren't ready yet and to calibrate his response accordingly. The CIA assessment estimated that without Penkovsky's intelligence, Kennedy would have faced the Cuban crisis with far less certainty about Soviet capabilities and intentions. The probability of miscalculation leading to nuclear exchange would have been significantly higher. One analyst wrote in the assessment, "We ask intelligence officers to provide information that shapes policy. Penkovsky provided information that prevented nuclear war. By any measure, this is the highest possible success in intelligence work." But the assessment also acknowledged the cost. Penkovsky was executed by the state he betrayed. His family was stigmatized for decades. His legacy in Russia remains controversial. The West honors him as hero who prevented catastrophe. Russia remembers him as traitor. Both assessments are true depending on perspective. In Russia, Penkovsky's legacy remains complicated. The official position is that he was traitor who betrayed his country and deserved execution. But some Russian historians and former intelligence officers have argued for more nuanced assessment. Sergei Kondrashev, former KGB officer who worked on the Penkovsky investigation, published memoir in 2001 with chapter about the case. He wrote, "Penkovsky believed he was preventing nuclear war by ensuring the West understood Soviet actual capabilities. From Soviet perspective, he betrayed military secrets to the enemy. From his perspective, he was trying to save both countries from mutual destruction caused by Khrushchev's reckless bluffing. History suggests he may have been right, even though his methods were treason under Soviet law." The complexity reflects broader questions about loyalty, duty, and moral choice during the Cold War. Penkovsky swore oath to defend the Soviet Union. He held security clearances that required him to protect classified information. He violated those oaths and betrayed those clearances, but his motivation was to prevent what he believed was Khrushchev's reckless approach from triggering nuclear war that would destroy both sides. His intelligence provision arguably helped achieve that goal. Was he traitor or hero? The answer depends on whether loyalty to state supersedes broader moral responsibility to prevent catastrophe. Different ethical frameworks provide different answers. What is not debatable is the impact of his intelligence. Penkovsky changed Cold War history. The intelligence he provided shaped the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he accomplished this while being dismissed by his colleagues as naive and foolish. In 2007, British historian Christopher Andrew published Authorized History of MI6 Operations. The Penkovsky chapter was titled "The Spy Who Saved the World." The title was not hyperbole. Andrew documented how Penkovsky's intelligence had been indispensable to Kennedy's crisis management and had significantly reduced the probability of nuclear exchange. American intelligence officers who had worked with Penkovsky's material were interviewed for the history. One analyst stated, "We knew what the Soviets had, we knew what they could do, we knew what they couldn't do. That knowledge was priceless during October 1962. Without it, we would have been guessing. And guessing wrong about nuclear war has only one outcome." In 2018, Russian television produced a documentary about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The documentary included extensive coverage of Penkovsky's espionage and its impact. The documentary presented balanced assessment, acknowledging that his intelligence had contributed to peaceful crisis resolution, while also noting that his methods constituted treason under Soviet law. The documentary included interview with Penkovsky's daughter, who had been a child when her father was arrested. She described growing up with stigma of being traitor's daughter. She was denied educational opportunities. She was monitored by security services. She lived with suspicion and marginalization for decades. "My father made his choice," she stated. "He believed he was doing the right thing. I have spent my life paying for that choice. I understand why he did it. I understand why the state executed him. I don't know if he was hero or traitor. I only know he was my father, and I never saw him again after October 1962. The personal cost of Penkovsky's decision extended beyond his own execution. His family suffered for generations, and the vindication that came decades later did nothing to alleviate that suffering. In intelligence work, there are rarely clean victories. There are only choices between bad options and worse options. Penkovsky chose to betray his oath to prevent what he believed would be catastrophic war. He succeeded in providing information that contributed to peaceful crisis resolution. He was executed for treason. All of these facts are true simultaneously. The people who dismissed him as naive and foolish were wrong about his capabilities, but they were operating within institutional frameworks that made accurate assessment nearly impossible. The KGB officers who missed his espionage for 18 months weren't incompetent. They were working with assessment frameworks that Penkovsky had deliberately exploited. The pattern continues. Intelligence organizations still struggle to distinguish between sources who are genuinely foolish and sources who are brilliantly exploiting organizational biases. Security procedures still rely on behavioral profiles that sophisticated operatives can manipulate. And institutional memory remains short because the most embarrassing failures are the ones most likely to be classified and forgotten. 50 years after Penkovsky's execution, the lesson remains relevant. The people who appear most incompetent may be the ones with clearest understanding of what's actually happening. And the assessments that seem most obviously correct may be the ones most dangerously wrong. Oleg Penkovsky died in May 1963, executed as traitor by the state he had sworn to defend. His colleagues at GRU, who had mocked him as naive, never revised their assessment. His executioners at KGB maintained for decades that his intelligence had been of minimal value. They were wrong about everything, and by the time they acknowledged it, the acknowledgment was too late to matter to anyone except historians. The briefcase Penkovsky carried into the American Embassy in 1962 contained technical manuals that changed the outcome of the Cold War's most dangerous confrontation, and the man who carried it had been dismissed as a fool right up until the moment he was proven to be the most consequential spy in Cold War history. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. It helps us share more forgotten Cold War histories where the people who were mocked proved to be the ones who saw most clearly. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold stories. Each one reveals patterns that remain relevant today. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from intelligence professionals to students of history. You're part of keeping these lessons alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for understanding that the person everyone dismisses as incompetent might be the one who understands the situation better than anyone else in the room. April 20th, 1961. GRU Headquarters, Kodinka Airfield, Moscow. Colonel Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky sat in the officers' mess, enduring another lecture from his colleagues about proper Soviet behavior. The criticism had become routine. Penkovsky was too friendly with foreigners, too enthusiastic about Western culture, too careless about maintaining proper ideological distance. "You act like you're on holiday when you travel abroad," Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Polyakov told him. "Intelligence officers maintain cover. You make friends. It's unprofessional." Penkovsky smiled and agreed. He had learned that agreeing was easier than arguing. His colleagues saw him as naive, perhaps even foolish. A competent officer, certainly. His technical knowledge of missile systems was excellent, but his judgment about people, his comfort with Westerners, his obvious enjoyment of foreign assignments, all of it marked him as someone who lacked proper Soviet discipline. The GRU was Soviet military intelligence, rival to the better-known KGB. While KGB focused on internal security and political intelligence, GRU handled military and technical matters. Penkovsky had joined GRU in 1955 after distinguished service in the Red Army during World War II. He had been promoted to colonel. He had been given increasing responsibility for assessing Western military capabilities, and he had been growing increasingly disillusioned with Soviet leadership. What his colleagues didn't know, what no one at GRU headquarters suspected, was that Penkovsky had been attempting to make contact with Western intelligence for over a year. He had approached American students in Moscow. He had passed notes to Western diplomats. He had tried to signal his willingness to provide information. Every attempt had failed. The Americans suspected provocation. The British were cautious. No one believed that a Soviet colonel with access to genuine military secrets would volunteer to spy for the West. The attempts were obviously traps designed to identify and compromise Western intelligence officers. Penkovsky's frustration was growing. He had information that could shift the balance of the Cold War. He understood Soviet missile capabilities and knew they were far less advanced than Kremlin propaganda claimed. He had access to technical manuals, deployment schedules, readiness assessments. He knew the Soviet nuclear arsenal was smaller, less reliable, and less capable than Western intelligence estimated. But he couldn't give it away. No one would take it. In May 1961, Penkovsky was assigned to accompany a Soviet trade delegation to London. The assignment was routine. The delegation would discuss agricultural equipment sales. Penkovsky would assess British industrial capabilities and report on any military intelligence opportunities. What happened in London would make Penkovsky the most valuable intelligence asset in Cold War history, but it would also guarantee his death. And the people who dismissed him as a fool would never acknowledge that they'd been wrong. The Penkovsky case reveals a pattern that repeats throughout intelligence history. Organizations systematically dismiss warnings and evidence from sources they have prejudged as unreliable. And by the time they realize their assessment was wrong, the opportunity to act on the information has passed. Penkovsky was dismissed as naive and overly friendly with foreigners. This assessment shaped how his colleagues interpreted his behavior. His extensive Western contacts were seen as personality flaw rather than intelligence operation. His enthusiasm for foreign assignments was treated as lack of proper Soviet discipline rather than cover for espionage. The assessment was wrong, but it persisted because it confirmed existing biases about what traitors looked like and how they behaved. Intelligence organizations expect traitors to be careful, secretive, and paranoid. They expect them to minimize contact with foreigners and avoid attention. They expect them to show signs of ideological alienation or financial desperation. Penkovsky was none of these things. He was openly friendly with Westerners. He volunteered for foreign assignments. He showed no obvious ideological problems. He didn't need money. By every standard profile, he was terrible spy candidate. So when he tried to make contact with Western intelligence for over a year before succeeding, his approaches were dismissed as obvious provocations. No genuine Soviet intelligence officer would be so clumsy and obvious. Except he was genuine, and his apparent clumsiness was calculated. He understood that careful, secretive behavior would draw more suspicion than open friendliness. He hid in plain sight, using his colleagues' assessment of him as naive and foolish to justify behavior that should have triggered security concerns. The pattern repeats because organizations prefer comfortable assessments over uncomfortable reality. Acknowledging that Penkovsky was a spy would have required admitting that security procedures had failed and personality assessments were wrong. It was easier to maintain the assessment that he was naive but harmless, until he was arrested with comprehensive documentation of his espionage activities, at which point it was too late to prevent the damage. The same pattern appeared in the Able Archer 83 crisis. Intelligence professionals warned that Soviet leadership genuinely believed NATO was preparing first strike. Their warnings were dismissed because the assessment contradicted comfortable assumptions about Soviet rationality. By the time the danger was acknowledged, the world had already come within hours of nuclear war. The same pattern appeared before the September 11th attacks. Intelligence officers warned that al-Qaeda was planning major attack on American soil using aircraft. Their warnings were dismissed because the assessment seemed implausible and the sources seemed unreliable. By the time the warnings were vindicated, thousands were dead. The pattern is institutional. Organizations develop assessments about threats, sources, and reliability. Once those assessments are established, evidence that contradicts them is rationalized away or dismissed. The people who challenge the assessments are marginalized as alarmist or naive, and the assessments remain in place until catastrophic failure forces revision. Penkovsky understood this dynamic. In one of his messages to MI6 written in 1962, he explained his strategy. "My colleagues think I am foolish and too friendly with foreigners. I encourage this assessment. It allows me to operate freely because they have decided I am harmless. They will not revise this assessment until they are forced to by evidence too overwhelming to dismiss. By then, I will have provided everything you need." He was right. His colleagues maintained their assessment of him as naive and harmless for 18 months while he photographed 5,000 classified documents and fundamentally shifted the strategic balance of the Cold War. KGB surveillance noted his extensive Western contacts. They documented his meetings. They logged his attendance at diplomatic functions. All of it went into his security file. And the assessment remained. Too friendly with foreigners, but not suspicious. Naive, but harmless. The failure wasn't lack of information. The failure was the framework used to interpret the information. Once KGB had decided Penkovsky was naive rather than calculating, every piece of evidence was interpreted through that lens. After his arrest, KGB conducted internal investigation into how he had operated undetected for so long. The investigation concluded. Subject successfully exploited personality assessment by colleagues who viewed him as incompetent at maintaining proper ideological distance. This assessment prevented proper scrutiny of his activities. Recommendation: security evaluations should not rely on personality judgments that may reflect subjects' intentional presentation rather than actual character. The recommendation was filed, security procedures were updated, and institutional memory gradually faded because the case was classified and the details were embarrassing. 20 years later, KGB would fail to detect Aldrich Ames, CIA officer who spied for the Soviet Union for 9 years while displaying obvious security violations. Ames spent money far beyond his salary, drank heavily, and showed poor judgment in numerous ways. His colleagues dismissed these warning signs because Ames seemed too incompetent to be a spy. The same pattern, the same failure, the same comfortable assessment that prevented recognition of uncomfortable reality. Organizations don't learn from failures they won't acknowledge. Penkovsky's case was classified for decades. The actual damage assessment was sealed. The official narrative minimized his intelligence contribution. So the lesson, that people who seem incompetent or naive may be neither, was never learned, and the pattern repeated. June 1961 through September 1962, Moscow and Washington, D.C. The intelligence from Penkovsky exceeded every expectation Western analysts had held. This wasn't incremental improvement in understanding Soviet capabilities. This was complete transformation of the intelligence picture. Penkovsky had access to GRU's most sensitive technical assessments. As a colonel specializing in missile systems, he evaluated Western military capabilities and compared them to Soviet equivalents. His work required comprehensive knowledge of Soviet strategic forces. He photographed everything: technical manuals for R-12 medium-range ballistic missiles, the same missiles that would later be deployed to Cuba, deployment procedures showing how long it took to make missiles operational, readiness assessments revealing maintenance problems and fuel limitations, command structures showing authorization chains for nuclear release, training documents detailing how Soviet missile crews were instructed. Most critically, Penkovsky provided honest assessments of Soviet strategic capabilities versus propaganda claims. The Soviet Union claimed to have hundreds of operational ICBMs capable of reaching American cities. Nikita Khrushchev had boasted publicly about Soviet missile superiority, warning that Soviet rockets could hit a fly in space. Penkovsky's documents told a different story. The Soviet ICBM force was far smaller than claimed. Many missiles existed only as prototypes. Production delays meant operational deployment was years behind schedule. Reliability problems meant that even deployed missiles frequently failed. And most importantly, Soviet missile targeting accuracy was so poor that hitting specific military targets was nearly impossible. CIA analysts who had estimated Soviet ICBM strength at 300 to 500 operational missiles learned the actual number: fewer than 50. And many of those 50 had significant readiness problems. This wasn't just intelligence. This was strategic revolution. The entire basis of American nuclear strategy rested on assumptions about Soviet missile capabilities. Defense budgets were built around countering Soviet advantages that apparently didn't exist. Diplomatic negotiations were structured around Soviet strengths that were largely fictional. President Kennedy was briefed on Penkovsky's intelligence in August 1961. The briefing lasted 2 hours. Kennedy absorbed the implications immediately. The missile gap he had campaigned on during the 1960 election didn't exist. American strategic superiority was far greater than anyone had realized. But the intelligence created a dilemma. If Kennedy revealed publicly that Soviet missile capabilities were far weaker than claimed, it would compromise the source. Penkovsky would be exposed and executed, and the intelligence flow would end. Kennedy decided to protect the source. American nuclear strategy would be adjusted privately based on Penkovsky's intelligence. But publicly, the administration would continue acting as if Soviet strategic forces were formidable. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Penkovsky continued his extraordinarily dangerous work. He met with Greville Wynne during Wynne's business trips to Moscow, passing film in carefully orchestrated exchanges. He used dead drops to leave packages at predetermined locations where MI6 officers could retrieve them. He attended diplomatic receptions and passed material to Western embassy personnel in brief conversations. Every meeting risked exposure. KGB maintained surveillance on all Western contacts with Soviet officials. Penkovsky's frequent interactions with Wynne were noted. His attendance at diplomatic functions was logged. His foreign contacts were documented in his security file, but the KGB assessment remained. Penkovsky was naive and overly friendly with foreigners, but not suspicious. His position gave him access to sensitive material, but his activities appeared consistent with legitimate professional duties. He was watched, but not actively suspected. Penkovsky's motivation wasn't financial. He refused payment beyond expense reimbursement. His motivation was ideological and personal. He had grown disillusioned with Soviet leadership after Khrushchev's reckless behavior during the Berlin crisis and his constant threats of nuclear war. Penkovsky believed Khrushchev was playing a dangerous game, bluffing about Soviet military power while simultaneously risking war through provocative actions. Penkovsky wanted to prevent nuclear war by ensuring Western leaders understood Soviet actual capabilities. If the West knew Soviet strategic forces were far weaker than claimed, they wouldn't be intimidated by Khrushchev's threats. They could call his bluffs. But Penkovsky's personal history also drove his actions. His father had been a White Army officer during the Russian Civil War, fighting against the Bolsheviks. This fact had marked Penkovsky's entire career. Despite distinguished service in World War II and competent intelligence work, he had been denied promotion to general because of his father's political background. The Soviet system he risked his life to betray had already betrayed him. He would never rise higher than colonel because of something his father had done decades before his birth. The bitterness shaped his willingness to commit treason. In June 1962, Penkovsky passed information about a new Soviet operation, deployment of R-12 missiles to Cuba. The missiles were being secretly shipped. Installation would begin in summer 1962. The objective was to present the United States with a fait accompli, forcing American acceptance of Soviet nuclear weapons 90 miles from Florida. Penkovsky provided the deployment schedule, the missile specifications, and, critically, the timeline for making the missiles operational. From arrival to operational status required approximately 4 weeks. Installation sites needed to be prepared. Missiles needed to be erected and fueled. Warheads needed to be mated to missiles. Crews needed to complete final checks. This intelligence would prove decisive 3 months later. On October 14, 1962, American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft photographed Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba. The photographs showed R-12 missiles being installed, exactly as Penkovsky's intelligence had predicted. President Kennedy convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. The group met continuously for 13 days to manage what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world came closer to nuclear war than at any point in history. But Kennedy held one crucial advantage. He knew from Penkovsky's intelligence exactly how long it took to make R-12 missiles operational. The photographs showed the missiles weren't ready yet. The installations were incomplete. The warheads hadn't arrived. The Soviets were weeks away from operational capability. Khrushchev was bluffing, trying to force American concessions by threatening nuclear war with weapons that weren't yet ready to fire. On October 22nd, Kennedy announced a naval blockade of Cuba. American warships would stop Soviet vessels carrying additional missiles. The confrontation was direct and potentially catastrophic. But Kennedy knew something Khrushchev didn't realize he knew. The missiles already in Cuba couldn't be fired yet. Soviet submarines approached the blockade line. American destroyers tracked them. At several points, Soviet submarine commanders considered using nuclear torpedoes against American vessels. The world was hours from nuclear war. On October 28th, Khrushchev backed down. He agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for American non-invasion guarantee and secret removal of American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended. Kennedy had won the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War by calling Khrushchev's bluff, and he could call that bluff because Oleg Penkovsky had provided the intelligence showing the bluff was exactly that. 3 days before the crisis ended, on October 22nd, the same day Kennedy announced the blockade, something happened in Moscow that would seal Penkovsky's fate. KGB surveillance finally connected all the pieces they'd been collecting for 18 months. Penkovsky was arrested at his apartment. In his possession, Minox camera, special film, encryption materials, dead-drop instructions, and the schedule for his next meeting with Wynne. The spy everyone had dismissed as too naive to be dangerous turned out to be the most valuable Western intelligence asset in Soviet history. And the KGB had missed it for 18 months because their assessment matched what Penkovsky's GRU colleagues believed. He was just a fool who was too friendly with foreigners. By the time they realized their mistake, Penkovsky had already changed the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. May 6, 1961, Mount Royal Hotel, London. Greville Wynne was a British businessman who sold industrial equipment to Soviet buyers. He had arranged the trade delegation's visit to London and was hosting them at the Mount Royal Hotel. Wynne had worked with Soviet officials before. He found them pleasant enough, if carefully controlled by their minders. Colonel Penkovsky was different. He engaged with genuine enthusiasm. He asked detailed questions about British manufacturing. He showed real interest in Western life, rather than maintaining the usual ideological distance. And on the second evening of the delegation's visit, he asked Wynne if they could speak privately. They walked through Hyde Park. Standard procedure for avoiding surveillance. Penkovsky spoke in Russian while Wynne listened carefully, understanding enough to follow the conversation. "I have information that your government needs," Penkovsky stated. "I am a colonel in GRU. I have access to Soviet missile program documentation. I want to provide this information to British intelligence." Wynne's first reaction was suspicion. This was obviously a provocation. Soviet intelligence had sent Penkovsky to identify British intelligence contacts by making an absurdly obvious approach. Penkovsky anticipated the doubt. "I know you think this is a trap. I have tried to make contact with Western intelligence for over a year. No one believes me, but I have proof." He handed Wynne an envelope. Inside were technical diagrams of Soviet missile guidance systems. The documents appeared genuine. The level of detail was extraordinary. This wasn't disinformation designed to mislead. It was actual classified material. Wynne agreed to pass the information to British contacts. He didn't commit to anything beyond that. The next day, Wynne contacted his business associate Dickie Franks, who happened to be an MI6 officer operating under business cover. Franks examined Penkovsky's documents and immediately recognized their significance. If genuine, these were among the most sensitive Soviet military secrets in existence. MI6 arranged a meeting. On May 10th, Penkovsky met with MI6 officers at a safe house in London. The meeting lasted 6 hours. Penkovsky outlined what he could provide: technical specifications for Soviet missile systems, deployment procedures, readiness timelines, command structures, and most critically, accurate assessments of Soviet strategic capabilities versus propaganda claims. MI6 officers subjected him to intense interrogation. They tested his knowledge. They looked for inconsistencies. They tried to determine if he was genuine or if this was sophisticated Soviet disinformation. Penkovsky passed every test. His technical knowledge was flawless. His descriptions matched what limited intelligence the West possessed, and his motivation was clear and consistent. He believed Soviet leadership was dangerously incompetent and reckless. He wanted to prevent nuclear war by ensuring the West understood actual Soviet capabilities rather than propaganda exaggerations. The MI6 assessment. Penkovsky was genuine, and he had access to intelligence that could transform Western understanding of Soviet military power. There was one problem. Penkovsky was returning to Moscow in 3 days. Establishing secure communication channels in Moscow would be extremely difficult. The KGB maintained comprehensive surveillance of Western embassy personnel and anyone who contacted them. Penkovsky proposed a solution. He would photograph classified documents using a Minox spy camera. He would pass the film to Greville Wynne during Wynne's business trips to Moscow. Wynne traveled to Moscow regularly for legitimate business purposes. His contacts with Soviet officials were expected. Meetings with Penkovsky could appear as normal business discussions. MI6 agreed. So did CIA, which was immediately briefed on the recruitment. Penkovsky would become a joint MI6 CIA operation, codenamed Hero. On May 13, 1961, Penkovsky returned to Moscow. In his briefcase was a Minox camera, special film, and instructions for dead-drop procedures. Over the next 18 months, he would photograph over 5,000 classified documents and pass them to Western intelligence. What he didn't know was that KGB surveillance had already noted his contacts with Wynne. They hadn't yet realized the significance, but they were watching. October 22, 1962 through May 1963. Lubyanka Prison, Moscow. Penkovsky's arrest was conducted with precision born of months of surveillance. KGB had finally connected all the evidence they'd been collecting: meetings with Wynne, attendance at Western diplomatic functions, contact with suspected intelligence officers, unexplained absences, photography equipment purchased through unusual channels. They had been building a file while Penkovsky provided intelligence that changed the outcome of history's most dangerous nuclear confrontation. The interrogation began immediately. KGB wanted to know everything. What had he provided? How long had he been spying? What were his contacts? What were his methods? And most importantly, how much damage had he done to Soviet security? Penkovsky refused to cooperate initially. He understood that full confession would mean death. As long as he could maintain some ambiguity about what he'd provided, there was hope he might survive with prison sentence rather than execution. The interrogation lasted 8 months. KGB used psychological pressure, not physical torture. They presented him with evidence of his meetings. They showed him surveillance photographs. They played recordings of his conversations. They demonstrated that they knew about his activities even if they didn't yet understand the full extent of his intelligence provision. Slowly, carefully, they reconstructed what Penkovsky had done. Meanwhile, Greville Wynne had been arrested in Budapest on November 2, 1962, during a business trip. Hungarian security services working with KGB had detained him. He was transported to Moscow and imprisoned at Lubyanka. Wynne's trial began in May 1963. He was charged with espionage, specifically with serving as courier for Penkovsky's intelligence material. The trial was show trial designed to demonstrate Soviet capability to catch Western spies. Wynne was paraded before cameras. His confession was extracted. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. But Wynne was bargaining chip, not primary target. He was British citizen whose imprisonment created diplomatic leverage. The Soviets calculated they could eventually exchange him for captured Soviet agents in the West. Penkovsky faced different calculation. He was Soviet military officer who had betrayed his country during wartime crisis. There would be no exchange. There would be no diplomatic bargaining. There would be execution. His trial was conducted in closed session, not for public display like Wynne's trial. The evidence was too sensitive. Admitting publicly what Penkovsky had provided would reveal to the West exactly how comprehensive his intelligence had been. The prosecution presented evidence of his espionage activities. They showed the photographs he'd taken. They displayed the equipment he'd used. They documented his meetings with Western intelligence. What they didn't reveal publicly was the assessment of damage. Internal KGB reports calculated that Penkovsky had provided intelligence that fundamentally shifted the strategic balance. His information about Soviet missile capabilities had allowed Kennedy to call Khrushchev's bluff during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that assessment remained classified. Publicly, KGB characterized Penkovsky's intelligence as marginally significant and claimed it had provided the West with information of limited operational value. The trial lasted 3 days. The verdict was predetermined. Penkovsky was convicted of treason and sentenced to death. On May 16, 1963, Oleg Penkovsky was executed. The official statement said he was shot by firing squad. Other accounts suggested he was burned alive in a crematorium furnace, though this has never been definitively confirmed. His family was not notified. His name was erased from official records. His colleagues at GRU were told he had been exposed as traitor and executed, with no details provided. The KGB file on Penkovsky, declassified decades later, contained a final assessment. Subject provided enemy intelligence services with classified military information. Assessment of value. Subject believed his information was of significant strategic importance. Actual intelligence value was minimal. Subject's inflated self-assessment was typical of his personality defects noted throughout his career. They had executed the man who provided the intelligence that determined the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and their official assessment was that his information had been of minimal value. The dismissal was consistent with how his GRU colleagues had always viewed him: competent at technical work, but naive, overconfident, and lacking proper judgment. They never acknowledged that the fool they'd mocked had possessed better judgment than the entire Soviet intelligence apparatus. He'd understood that Khrushchev's missile bluff would fail if the West knew Soviet actual capabilities. He'd been right. And they'd been so catastrophically wrong that they couldn't admit it even after executing him. April 22, 1964. Heerstrasse border crossing, West Berlin. Greville Wynne walked across the border from East to West Berlin, exchanged for Soviet agent Konon Molody, known in the West as Gordon Lonsdale. Wynne had served 18 months of his 8-year sentence. The exchange had been negotiated through back channels for months. Western journalists were waiting. Wynne was questioned about his experience. He described his imprisonment, his trial, his treatment. He confirmed that he had served as courier for Soviet intelligence source. But he couldn't name the source. Penkovsky's execution had been announced in May 1963, but Western intelligence wanted details about his intelligence provision kept classified. The less the Soviets knew about what the West had learned from Penkovsky, the better. Wynne wrote a memoir published in 1967 titled The Man from Moscow. The book described his espionage work and imprisonment. It became bestseller in Britain. But Wynne couldn't tell the complete story. The intelligence Penkovsky had provided remained classified. The role that intelligence played in the Cuban Missile Crisis was still secret. Western intelligence services faced difficult problem. Penkovsky had been their most valuable human intelligence source of the Cold War. His intelligence had transformed Western understanding of Soviet strategic capabilities. It had enabled Kennedy to successfully navigate the Cuban Missile Crisis. But acknowledging this publicly would reveal to the Soviets exactly how compromised their strategic deception had been. It would show that the missile gap Kennedy had campaigned on in 1960 was fiction. It would demonstrate that Khrushchev's nuclear threats had been bluffs, called because the West knew Soviet actual capabilities, so they remained silent. Penkovsky's role was classified at the highest levels. CIA and MI6 files were sealed. Analysts who had worked with his intelligence were prohibited from discussing it. The result was historical distortion. Books about the Cuban Missile Crisis focused on Kennedy's crisis management, on Khrushchev's calculations, on the naval confrontation. They described intelligence from U-2 reconnaissance and signals intercepts. They didn't mention that Kennedy knew the missiles weren't operational yet because a Soviet colonel had photographed the installation procedures and timeline. Soviet historical accounts were even more distorted. Official Soviet history of the Cuban Missile Crisis portrayed Khrushchev's decision to remove the missiles as strategic success. He had secured American non-invasion guarantee. He had achieved his objective of protecting Cuban revolution. There was no mention that Kennedy had called his bluff because Soviet intelligence security had catastrophically failed. No acknowledgement that American intelligence possessed comprehensive assessment of Soviet missile capabilities because of penetration at the highest levels. Penkovsky's name appeared in brief mentions as traitor who had provided the West with information of limited value. His execution was justified as appropriate response to treason. His intelligence was characterized as minor tactical details that had no strategic significance. The people who had dismissed him as naive and too friendly with foreigners never revised their assessment. They simply erased him. In 1977, KGB opened portions of their Cuban Missile Crisis files to selected Soviet historians. The files described intelligence activities, crisis management, and Soviet decision-making. Penkovsky was mentioned in a single paragraph. GRU Colonel Oleg Penkovsky was recruited by British intelligence in 1961. He provided classified military information until his arrest in October 1962. The material he provided was assessed as marginally significant. American intelligence capabilities during the Cuban crisis derived primarily from signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance. Penkovsky's contribution was minimal. The assessment was filed away and accepted as authoritative. Soviet military historians working on Cuban Missile Crisis research cited it as evidence that Western claims about Soviet intelligence failures were exaggerated. Western intelligence services knew the Soviet assessment was completely false, but they couldn't correct it without revealing classified sources and methods, so they let the false narrative stand. The truth remained locked in classified files, while both sides constructed historical accounts that systematically misrepresented what had actually happened. Penkovsky had provided the intelligence that allowed Kennedy to win the Cold War's most dangerous confrontation, and both sides agreed, for different reasons, to pretend it hadn't mattered. 1985 through 1992, Moscow and Washington. Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, openness, began revealing Soviet Cold War secrets that had been classified for decades. Archives opened. Historians gained access to previously sealed files. Veterans of intelligence services published memoirs. And the truth about Oleg Penkovsky finally emerged. In 1985, KGB General Oleg Kalugin published memoir describing his career in Soviet intelligence. Kalugin had worked on counterintelligence during the 1960s. He had reviewed the Penkovsky case files after the arrest. Kalugin's assessment contradicted the official KGB narrative. Penkovsky was the most damaging penetration Soviet military intelligence ever suffered. The material he provided gave the West comprehensive understanding of our strategic capabilities. The official assessment that his intelligence was of minimal value was self-serving fiction designed to minimize the embarrassment of such catastrophic security failure. Kalugin described internal KGB assessments that had never been made public. Penkovsky had photographed over 5,000 classified documents. The material included technical specifications for every Soviet missile system, deployment procedures, command structures, and honest assessments of Soviet strategic capabilities versus propaganda claims. The West knew more about our missile forces than most of our own generals, Kalugin wrote. Penkovsky's intelligence fundamentally shifted the strategic balance by giving the Americans accurate assessment of what we could actually do versus what we claimed we could do. Western intelligence services began declassifying Penkovsky material in response. In 1987, CIA released study titled The Penkovsky Papers: Assessment of Intelligence Value. The study was comprehensive evaluation of the intelligence Penkovsky had provided and its impact on American policy. The assessment, Penkovsky's intelligence was the most valuable human intelligence collection of the Cold War. It had transformed American understanding of Soviet strategic capabilities. It had provided Kennedy with the knowledge necessary to successfully navigate the Cuban Missile Crisis. It had shaped American nuclear strategy for years. The CIA study included previously classified assessments from 1961 to 1962. Intelligence analysts had written at the time that Penkovsky's material was intelligence collection of historic significance and potentially war-winning advantage in strategic assessment. These assessments had been sealed for 25 years. Now they were public. The official narrative that Penkovsky had provided information of minimal value was revealed as complete fabrication. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Russian intelligence services inherited KGB and GRU archives. Some files were open to researchers, others were declassified and published. The complete Penkovsky file was released in 1992. It contained everything: his recruitment by MI6, his intelligence provision timeline, the assessment of what he had provided, his interrogation transcripts, his trial records, and, critically, the internal damage assessment KGB had conducted after his arrest. The damage assessment was marked for Politburo members only and had never been shared beyond highest Soviet leadership. It stated, Penkovsky provided British and American intelligence with comprehensive assessment of Soviet strategic rocket forces, including deployment numbers, readiness levels, and technical capabilities. This intelligence allowed the United States to accurately assess Soviet strategic posture during the Caribbean Crisis, Soviet term for Cuban Missile Crisis. American knowledge of actual Soviet capabilities, as opposed to claimed capabilities, shaped their crisis management decisions and contributed to outcome favorable to American interests. Assessment. This represents the most significant compromise of Soviet military intelligence in our history. The subject's access to classified materials and his extended period of operation before detection resulted in strategic intelligence loss that cannot be fully quantified. The official characterization of his intelligence provision as minimal value is inaccurate and serves only to minimize embarrassment to GRU security procedures. The assessment had been written in December 1962, immediately after Penkovsky's arrest. It had been filed in the Politburo's classified archive and never mentioned again. Soviet leadership had known, from the moment they arrested Penkovsky, that he had provided intelligence of decisive strategic importance. They had known his information had shaped American behavior during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They had known the official narrative about minimal intelligence value was fiction, and they had maintained that fiction for 30 years because admitting the truth was too embarrassing. In 1998, the CIA and MI6 jointly published Comprehensive History of the Penkovsky Operation. The 400-page study described every aspect of his recruitment, intelligence provision, and impact. It included testimonials from analysts who had worked with his material and policymakers who had used his intelligence. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis, wrote in the foreword, "Penkovsky's intelligence was indispensable to President Kennedy's decision-making during October 1962. We knew from his material exactly what Soviet missiles were deployed in Cuba, how long it would take to make them operational, and what their technical capabilities and limitations were. This knowledge allowed us to manage the crisis with precision rather than guessing. Without Penkovsky's intelligence, the crisis might have ended very differently." The vindication was complete. The man the KGB had dismissed as providing minimal intelligence was revealed as the source of decisive strategic advantage. The colonel his GRU colleagues had mocked as too naive was proven to have possessed better judgment than the entire Soviet intelligence establishment. But the vindication came 35 years too late. Penkovsky had been executed in 1963. He died believing his own people would never acknowledge what he had accomplished. He was right about that, even as he was right about everything else. In 2003, Russian military intelligence published official history of GRU. The Penkovsky chapter was titled Lessons from Catastrophic Failure. It described his recruitment, operation, and arrest as case study in what happens when security procedures fail and personality assessments prove incorrect. The assessment: Penkovsky was evaluated by colleagues as naive and overly friendly with foreigners. This assessment was used to justify his extensive foreign contacts and meetings with Western nationals. The assessment proved catastrophically wrong. His behavior was not naivete, but calculated intelligence operation. The failure to recognize this represents systematic security failure at multiple levels. The history recommended reforms to security evaluation procedures. It emphasized the importance of behavioral analysis over surface judgments. It warned against dismissing security concerns because subjects seemed incompetent or foolish. The lesson had been learned 40 years after Penkovsky's execution and 42 years after his recruitment. Institutional learning had occurred eventually, but it had required collapse of the Soviet Union and opening of classified archives before the truth could be acknowledged. In 2007, a memorial was proposed for Penkovsky in Moscow. The proposal was submitted by Russian military historians who had studied his case. They argued that Penkovsky's motivation, whatever his methods, had been to prevent nuclear war. His intelligence had contributed to peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This deserved recognition. The proposal was rejected by Russian government. Official position: Penkovsky was traitor who had betrayed his country. His execution was justified. No memorial would be erected. But in 2010, a small plaque was installed at the location of the former British embassy in Moscow, where Penkovsky had first made contact with MI6 in 1961. The plaque was unofficial, placed by private individuals. It read, "In this location, Cold War history changed. Courage takes many forms." The plaque was removed by Moscow city authorities within 48 hours.